Welcome to Echoes of Battle. This video covers the Battle of Antietam in the Civil War.
Welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled you're joining me today because we're going to take a really in-depth look at a single date that completely changed the course of American history. I want you to picture it. September 17, 1862. Two enormous armies, the Union Army of the Potomac and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, are about to collide near a small Maryland town called Sharpsburg. Today, we're going to explore this pivotal event by breaking down the brilliant, the chaotic, and honestly, the deeply tragic mechanics of how this battle actually unfolded. But before we get into the tactical weeds, we really have to ground ourselves in the staggering reality of what happened on the ground that day. 23,000. Just pause and think about that. That is the number of American soldiers who were killed, wounded, or listed as missing. And here is the truly shocking part. That massive number was generated in just a single 12-hour period. It was, and it still remains, the bloodiest single day in American military history. Okay, let's dive right into this. We'll cover 1. Prelude to the clash, 2. Morning, the deadly Cornfield, 3. Midday, the sunken road, 4. Afternoon, the final attack, 5. The human cost, and finally 6. A transformed nation. Section 1. Prelude to the clash, the Maryland Campaign of 1862. So by the summer of 1862, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had taken command and recently scored some major victories in Virginia, notably the Second Battle of Bull Run. Riding that incredible momentum, Lee decides to risk taking the war straight into the North. And he's got 5 critical reasons for this invasion. First, he absolutely needed to move the fighting away from Virginia's already ruined landscape. Second, he wanted to deal a massive blow to Northern morale with a victory on Union soil. Third, he's hoping to encourage slaveholding Marylanders to actually defect and join the Confederacy. Fourth, a win up north might finally be the thing to secure diplomatic recognition and support from European powers. And lastly, on a purely practical level, his army desperately needed to gather vital supplies, food, and equipment. Now, here's where we get a massive sliding doors moment that completely alters the entire campaign. On September 9th, Lee issues Special Order 191, which details the scattered, very vulnerable movements of his army. But a copy of this crucial order gets lost by the Confederates and is literally discovered by Union soldiers. I mean, what are the odds? This unbelievable intelligence leak eventually makes its way to Union General George B. McClellan. Because his plans are now totally exposed, Lee is forced into a panic to rapidly reunite his scattered forces, fighting a frantic delaying action at South Mountain before concentrating everyone he can at Sharpsburg, right along Antietam Creek. Meanwhile, another chunk of his army was busy wrapping up a siege at Harper's Ferry, capturing 12,000 Union soldiers, sure, but losing extremely precious time in the process. So the stage is set. Across Antietam Creek stand 2 commanders with wildly different advantages. General McClellan commands the Army of the Potomac. He has massive numerical superiority, and he actually knows Lee's general plans. But he moves incredibly cautiously, and as we're going to see, really struggles to coordinate his overwhelming numbers. On the flip side, General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia are badly outnumbered, but they are relying on strong, natural defensive terrain. Think farms, hills, woods, and excellent internal lines of communication that allow Lee to rapidly shift his troops to reinforce wherever he's threatened. Section 2. Morning. The deadly Cornfield. Dawn strikes at the Miller farm. The battle kicks off right at dawn on the Confederate left flank. Union General Joseph Hooker's I Corps advances toward a 24-acre cornfield on the Miller farm, and waiting for them in that tall corn are Confederate soldiers under the command of General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. The visceral, close-quarters chaos that erupts here is almost impossible to overstate. That tall corn provided essentially zero protection from artillery and musket fire. Union formations would push forward, only to be hit by fierce, immediate Confederate counterattacks. The fighting is just incredibly violent. Entire regiments are devastated within minutes. And even when the Union 12th Corps joins the fray, neither side can lock down a decisive advantage. 6. That's the number of times this blood-soaked 24-acre cornfield changed hands in just a few short hours that morning. Units advanced, completely collapsed, regrouped, and attacked again in what was just an absolute meat grinder of combat. And the morning's horror didn't end in the cornfield. Union forces under General Edwin Sumner continued the assault into an area called the West Woods. But because of the dense, tricky terrain and some pretty disorganized formations, they walked right into a massive Confederate counterattack. Actually, let's put that in perspective. In just 20 minutes of fighting in those woods, approximately 2,200 out of the 5,300 Union soldiers involved were killed or wounded. By 10 a.m., nearly 10,000 men had already fallen, and the battle was still far from over. Section 3. Midday, the sunken road, the center of the Confederate line. As we push into midday, the fighting shifts south toward the center of Lee's lines. Here, Confederate soldiers had dug in along a sunken farm road. This embankment acted as a perfect natural trench, giving them incredible protection. As Union troops pushed forward over totally open ground, the Confederate defenders just poured intense, concentrated fire into their ranks. It was a brutal back and forth. Eventually, against all odds, Union forces managed to overwhelm the defenders and breach the line. The Confederate center was collapsing. This was McClellan's golden opportunity to split Lee's army right in half. But, thanks to sheer confusion, communication failures, and McClellan's refusal to commit fresh infantry reserves, he completely failed to exploit that gap, and the Confederate line barely held on. The scale of the violence here literally rewrote the map. That simple, sunken farm wagon path earned a grim new name that we still use today, Bloody Lane, because approximately 5,500 casualties fell right there in that single, concentrated midday struggle. Section 4. Afternoon, the final attack, Burnside's push on the southern flank. Now we're down on the southern edge of the battlefield in the afternoon, and Union General Ambrose Burnside is tasked with crossing Antietam Creek. Standing in his way is a narrow stone bridge, defended by just 500 Confederate soldiers from Georgia and South Carolina. Despite being massively outnumbered, these Confederates used the elevated terrain to delay Burnside's huge force for hours. Finally, Union troops fight their way across the bridge and start pushing Lee's completely exhausted right flank backward towards Sharpsburg. At this point, Lee's army is on the absolute brink of destruction. But then, and you really can't write a more dramatic moment than this, Confederate reinforcements under General A.P. Hill suddenly arrive. They had just finished a grueling 15-mile forced march all the way from Harper's Ferry, and they slam straight into Burnside's exposed flank, right at the critical moment, completely stopping the Union advance in its tracks. As the sun finally sets, the tactical fighting essentially ends in a draw. Neither army had managed to completely destroy the other. Lee's battered forces hold their ground for another day before quietly withdrawing across the Potomac River back into Virginia on the night of September 18th. So McClellan hadn't destroyed the Army of Northern Virginia, but he had successfully halted Lee's northern invasion. Section 5. The human cost, the aftermath of industrial-scale warfare. We have to take a second to think about the locals. The reality of this scale of violence engulfed the civilian population instantly. Every available structure in the area, farmhouses, barns, local churches, were immediately transformed into makeshift hospitals for thousands of bleeding men. The landscape itself was permanently scarred. For instance, the Muma family farm was deliberately burned to the ground by Confederate troops during the fighting, just to prevent Union sharpshooters from using its buildings for cover. But that shock extended way beyond the local farms of Maryland. Shortly after the battle, a photographer named Alexander Gardner arrives. His photographs of the bloated, unburied dead bodies lying exactly where they had fallen were soon displayed in galleries back east. This was a massive turning point in media history. Before this, the American public consumed war through, romanticized paintings and highly stylized written reports. Gardner brought the brutal, physical, completely unromanticized horror of the battlefield directly into American parlors for the very first time. Section 6. A transformed nation, the strategic and political legacy. So what is the big takeaway here? It's that this tactical stalemate handed the Union an enormous strategic and diplomatic victory. Lee's first major northern invasion was completely stopped in its tracks. President Abraham Lincoln's political position was significantly strengthened right at a time when he desperately needed it. Plus, the optics of the Confederate retreat firmly deterred European powers from openly recognizing or supporting the Confederacy. But most importantly by far, the conflict was about to fundamentally change from a war merely to preserve the Union into a war to destroy the institution of slavery altogether. This specific military opportunity paved the way for one of the most important documents in American history, See, Lincoln had actually drafted a proclamation against slavery months earlier, but he knew that if he issued it after a string of Union defeats, it would just look like an act of desperation. He was waiting for a win. Antietam was that win. Just 5 days after the battle, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln executes an absolute masterstroke, issuing the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This declared that enslaved people in areas still in rebellion would be freed, forever altering the fundamental purpose of the war. Which brings us to a final thought. How does a single day of muddy, chaotic, and terrifying combat completely rewrite the trajectory of human freedom in America? It's just incredible to think that the desperate, yard-by-yard struggles at the Cornfield, Bloody Lane, and Burnside Bridge didn't just decide who controlled a small creek in Maryland. They directly laid the absolute groundwork for emancipation and the transformation of the United States as we know it. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this profound piece of history. Until next time, keep questioning and keep learning.
Thank you for watching our video. Please like and subscribe, and thank you. Have a great day.